So, in 2011, Lana Del Rey, a popular singer, said fashion is inspired by youth and nostalgia and draws inspiration from the best of the past. Fashion in the past can have some pretty interesting styles. If you look deeper, each style or fad can tell the story of what was happening in the world at that time. The 1970s in particular was a huge movement for fashion, especially women's fashion. The women's liberation movement and the evolution of disco music had huge impacts on the way men and women dress. So, you may be wondering, how in the world does fashion from the 1970s have anything to do with me? As I said previously, each style can tell you exactly what was going on in the world at that time, and as we all know, history is what makes today. Inspiration from the past is much of what keeps today's fashion grounded and flowing at the same time. So, fashion has always been a love of mine, so it came as no surprise to my family when I wanted to study it in college. I've found that one of my favorite parts of fashion to study is the history and how fashion is affected by current events, what's going on in the world, and cultural aspects, and vice versa. So today we will examine fashion of the 1970s by first discussing significant political, social, and cultural events of the 1970s. Second, we'll examine how men's fashion was affected by those events, and lastly, we'll look at how women's fashion was affected by those events. So, we will now discuss several factors that contributed to those trends during the 1970s. Various factors during the 1970s influenced fashion trends, ranging from political events to TV shows to even popular music. The women's liberation movement was one of the biggest contributors to women's fashion during the 1970s. Women were moving at stellar rates into the workforce, which had never happened before. No longer were women staying at home, caring for the kids, and tending to housework. Feminists of the WLM fought for women's rights to do whatever they wanted to do without being subject to social standards of the time that dictated the way women dressed, conducted themselves, and even where they could or couldn't work. Charlie's Angels was one of the biggest TV shows of the 1970s. It featured beautiful, intelligent women portrayed by Farrah Fawcett and her fellow actresses, and sharply dressed men. Tulika Nair says in her article, 70s Fashion, if you want to see a visual representation of the 70s, just think Farrah Fawcett. Disco music emerged in the 1970s as a spin-off of popular funk music of the 60s. It was a new wave of music that fueled the wild and liberated nightlife of 1970s clubs. Lisa Robinson says in her article, Boogie Nights, for Vogue magazine, that disco was the sound of those who wanted to dance, 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 blotting out everything but their bodies and the beat. So now that we know a little more about what was going on in the 70s, I will explain how these events affected men's fashion trends. So men's fashion was similar to the 1960s, the previous decade, but it was more liberal than what it had been in the past, just like everything else in the 70s. Disco funk nightclubs meant lots of dancing for men, and this called for sharp-looking suits that still allowed free movement to get down on the dance floor. Bell-bottom pants gave room for moving around, and silk shirts kept clubgoers from overheating. The peoplehistory.com mentions in their article Fashion and Accessories of the 1970s that the popularized image of men's formal wear during this time was the white suit, made famous by the one and only John Travolta in the Saturday Night Fever. Denim and sweaters became kind of the go-to casual wear, and this kind of was denouncing society's previous idea that a person must be dressed to the nines at all times. Hairstyles also represented this attitude of liberation and freedom, with styles ranging from long, lengthy styles to curly and bodacious afros. So, as you can see, men's fashion went through some major changes in the 1970s, and now we will examine how women's fashion was affected during the 1970s. So, women's fashion was also undergoing some major trends. Women wanted to showcase their new freedom that was made possible through the women's liberation movement. The women's liberation movement allowed many things for women, including moving out of the home and into the workforce. Dresses were no longer functional for everyday life as a woman, so the transition from long dresses to pants began. Casual wear wanted to show off this new freedom too, so dress lengths went the exact opposite. They had gone from really long to really short, and boom, the miniskirt was born. Charlie's Angels was definitive in women's fashion, and the men's trend of bell-bottom pants trickled into women's styles as well. And women were now adjusting themselves to express their individual style and to please themselves rather than pleasing society, which they had done their entire lives at this point. So, in conclusion, we've learned how today we've learned how events in the 1970s affected the fashion of the 1970s. So, as you can see, events that make history can have a huge effect on fashion trends. The 1970s were notable for disco, big name TV stars, and the women's liberation movement. Fashion itself reflects the effect these events had on society. So, now, I hope you can see how fashion can teach us so much about history and how society handles major events, and maybe it even sparked your interest in fashion history. Thanks.